So your very simple question of describe a typical diet in the place I'm from. Well, uh, it sounds so easy. But the Nauruan diet, I suppose, can be broken up for analytical purposes into probably everyday food and feast food. And I'm going to start by talking about everyday food. Then I'm going to talk about feast food. Everyday food, in turn, can be loosely broken up into meals and snacks if you want to kind of follow Mary Douglas's approach to things. And I will in this case, just because it makes it a bit easier to talk about one element at a time. So a meal in Nauru is characterized by the inclusion of the ingredient rice. And a typical meal would usually be a standard dinner plate serving of a mound of rice on the plate, topped with what's referred to as a protein. So the protein might be an egg omelette or some form of barbecued fish or raw fish or some form of tinned meat, in some cases tins of spam or corned beef. Or also, many of these meals today are consumed in small Chinese restaurants around the island. And so it might be a stir-fried Chinese meat in a sauce of some description that's perched on top of the rice.
I work in the townships of South Africa, and I'm currently studying food insecurity and the impact this has on chronic disease or non-communicable disease. So the major foods that are consumed, or the staple foods consumed in townships, are maize, and they usually eat this with some sort of meat or with beans for a meal called sam. So this is our traditional foods that they brought from their indigenous type surroundings. Today, what we see is that there's a transition and there's a mix with the globalized food system. So we're seeing a move to eating more processed foods. There's a lot of McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken now that is also being integrated into the South African diet. So what my research does is it's looking at what behaviors do not promote the obesity and the chronic disease pandemic. So we know that not everybody in these townships are suffering from chronic disease. So I hope by studying those people and understanding what makes them resilient to getting a non-communicable disease or being at risk for non-communicable disease, I could affect policy and intervention that way.
Food can be used to help shape identity in that case, and as well as ethnic identity. Food is used during rituals, during rites. Specific foods are eaten at specific times to mark special events throughout life. So I think we can all agree that food is really important.
So the typical diet in Nauru today is something that's changed really relatively little since about the 1930s and 1940s, when one of the last food surveys was done. So what I'm describing today is something that's been around for 3 or 4 generations of Nauruan people now, and is considered by them in many respects to be their traditional diet. Meals in Nauru are defined by the inclusion of rice. Rice is a really important ingredient in any meal. It makes people feel full and satisfied, and a meal is not considered a meal without it, which is interesting because rice has never been cultivated on the island, even though it's considered to be a traditional staple food of the people there. The way that it's probably come into Nauru is via the indentured labourers who were involved in the mining industry in Nauru and have been so since about 1905, 1906. And a lot of the labourers that were brought in and imported to work in the mines were Chinese labourers. The other reason that rice has become important is because the island is just so isolated that when colonial authorities first moved there and began to live and work on the island, and missionaries in particular, rice was one of the few staple goods along with flour, which would keep for significant periods of time to be shipped into the country and then stored once there. Now, interestingly, prior to the adoption of rice in the country, Nauruan people had many older food practices that are no longer known today. One in particular involved the preservation of pandanus fruit. Now, pandanus fruit is a big fruit. It's about this big. It takes about 9 months to ripen. There are lots of different varieties, and the varieties that they had on Nauru growing in the center of the island were once a year harvested, and and turned into two different products. The first product, they were juiced, and the juice was reduced and cooked and kneaded in a series of lengthy practices that took about 2 months to complete. And this made a pandanus kind of paste, similar to, I suppose, dried fruit snacks that we give to children today. And that could be kept for 6 to 8 years at a time in the roof of a house, providing that it was aired regularly, so it had to be continually cared for, and provided, of course, that there were the social mechanisms in place that allowed people to keep food in the house and not just have it stolen or taken at any point in time. The other product that was made was a pandanus flour, which was made from different parts of the fruit after the juice had been removed, which were further cooked down and powdered, and which could also be kept for significant periods of time. So while it's a very isolated island, there were food practices that allowed people to survive in past times without the need for either importing foods or without significant starvation on the island.
Surrounded by a lagoon environment and wetlands, and people have been eating the resources in this environment for hundreds of years. And this is often referred to as bush food, and this can be have both a negative and a positive connotation. It has kind of been reappropriated for tourism purposes and promoted as kind of powerful, traditional, authentic local food. Whereas in the past, the term bushy was kind of utilized to as a racist term about Creole populations in rural areas. And youth learn about these bush resources by going out in the environment and hunting and fishing. And young boys around the ages of 8 to 14 participate in this after school. They'll build small slingshots and go out and catch iguana. But in addition to that, many of their family members also participate in this hunting and these fishing practices, both for local home subsistence, but also they will sell this in the city as well. And so young kids will accompany their parents to acquire these animals. And both men and women participate in the practice of fishing and hunting for iguana, coatimundi, armadillo, etc. And children will go with their families and will participate in the processing of these animals as well. And they may participate in some farming practices in small kitchen gardens, as well as herding of cows also.
When I think about food in the context of development, I think about the intersection of heritage and health. To use an example from southern Belize, in the Mopan Maya village of Santa Cruz, traditional Maya foods have become synonymous with health. So to be a healthy Maya person, it's important to eat bush foods or foods that are traditionally Maya. Perhaps the most important of which being corn, but many wild, picked foods or foods that are cultivated and sow very easily from year to year that are found in the forest or in the bush, as it's called, are considered to be healthy foods. And there's a lot of conversation around how when we start eating foods that aren't Maya foods, when we eat foods like hybrid chickens that are bought in the shop, or we eat tins of foods like sardines and those sorts of foods that you can buy in the store, that those are not healthy, not just because of the ingredients in the food, but they're not healthy because we're getting away from Maya tradition, and Maya traditional foods are healthy. So an interesting, consequence of this connection between Maya foods and healthy foods is that oftentimes foods that are determined to be healthy, as a consequence, are cast as traditional foods, whether they may or may not be traditional foods. An example of this is callaloo. Callaloo is a nutritious green that grows very easily in the forests of southern Belize. It's a green that has been traditionally eaten throughout the Caribbean, and is not specific to the Maya community, and not necessarily even traditional to the Maya community. It's a fairly recent food that has entered the Maya diet, and it's been cultivated and continues to sow itself in the forests in Maya villages. And it is spoken about as a healthy plant, which indeed, even by Western nutritional standards, it's a dark green. It's a healthy food, however we choose to define that. But it's defined as healthy in the Maya communities where I did my research, based on its connection to food heritage. So this is a really good example, not just about how dynamic foods and how we think of foods are, but about how heritage, and food heritage in this case, is a dynamic process, and how it's not static. We don't just look at traditional foods and then we look at new modern foods. Different foods over the course of time get recast as heritage foods through various processes. One of the processes that has affected this in the Maya communities in southern Belize is the saliency of asserting and celebrating a Maya identity. So being Maya is very important in a social and political economic context in southern Belize, and connection to the land, of which there are many foods that connect Maya people to the forest, become part of this dynamic heritage process that is part of sort of a lived experience of eating, of collecting, of living and being Maya.
My take-home message is that this issue is really complex and really deserves that attention to this dynamism that we find in food, right? So I'd like to use a couple of examples to kind of illustrate this. So the first example is from the Peruvian Andes, where I participated in some research with a research team. We were looking at issues of food insecurity, food and nutrition among women, among mothers in this particular community. So we found that dietary delocalization was really common. This idea that Pelto and Pelto developed in the 80s, that non-local food items were now being consumed as part of the local or part of the traditional diet, has become really common across the world. And we certainly saw this when we were in Peru. So as one example, the women that we talked with ate a lot of Quaker oats. Now, oats are not really new to this area, right? They had their own oats. They have their own grains, which are certainly different than oats. Things like amaranth, things like quinoa, and now have incorporated Quaker oats into traditional foods, such as mazamorra, or the porridge, the gruel that families eat almost every day. So beyond issues of health and nutrition, we can look at this issue from a more holistic perspective, right? That traditional anthropological perspective, bringing in economics, for example. So Quaker Oats is now supplying this local community with food, and women who purchase this food are essentially giving money to Quaker Oats, which that money now leaves the community, leaves these already mostly impoverished communities living in sometimes severe conditions. And now they have this non-local food item in the diet. So the real question I would ask is, what's the issue? What's the concern here? Is it health and nutrition? Is it on an economic level? Women also told us that they grow food, but they sell most of their food because they want to be part of this cash economy. They want to provide their children with books and other resources needed to get a good education because they value that. So this dietary delocalization is really occurring in that context of development in this particular case.
Tinned foods are also really important in the Nauruan diet today, but they have been for an awfully long time. The earliest records that we have go back to the late 1800s with the early German colonial powers, and also with missionaries. And early anthropologists from the period have celebrated the success of the colonial authorities because of the way in which they introduced these new products into the Nauruan diet and improved the health of the population. So there are some really strong links between nutritional change and health outcomes on the island. Now, not all of the health outcomes of this nutritional change were necessarily advantageous to the Nauruan population. For example, there was a very high rate of early infant death in the 1920s, and this was found to be linked to a decrease in the amount of pandanus, or a natural fruit from the island, that was being consumed, which is very, very high in vitamin B. And when that was realized, vitamin B supplements began to be given to mothers, and the infant mortality rate decreased again. But it just indicates the rate at which the Nauruan diet was changing in the very early stages of the 20th century.
Talking about shifting food and foodways in the context of development, I think that we need to remember and acknowledge that our food and foodways as a species, as a group, as humans, has always changed. It has always been dynamic. We can even look back to our evolutionary origins as primates. We did not start out eating meat, for example. We eventually did eat meat, which allowed us to expand our bigger brains. It also allowed us to develop bipedal locomotion, among other things. And eventually, culture came along, which profoundly changed the way that we were eating before.
Thinking about food in the context of development, it's difficult not to think about chronic disease. Increasing rates of obesity and diabetes have been linked by many scholars to a globalizing food system. The increasing availability of processed foods has been linked to obesity, linked to diabetes, and a link to this globalizing food world. I'd like to give an example from some research that I've done with the Guatemala Maya community in South Florida. This community has been migrating to South Florida since the 1980s, and so there's many members of the community that are multiple generations, yet there are still migrants coming from Guatemala every month. So it's various ages and various stages of migration, the Guatemala Maya community in South Florida. In 2009, I was asked to do an education intervention addressing obesity and diabetes with this community. It was thought that the community members were not able to understand the contents of these new foods, or the globalized foods of the new system, and that they needed to be educated to understand the ingredients in these foods and how they were related to their obesity and diabetes. As I conducted the research in the community, I found that members of the community were very articulate in expressing the ingredients in the foods and the types of foods that were leading to their chronic disease. Too much fat, too much salt, higher portion size. All of these things were articulated very clearly by members of the Guatemala Maya community.
The prevalence of obesity in Mexico and changing food practices is coughed up to, a generalized process of globalization, and changing transportation, services, and globalization of food processing and marketing and international trade and advancements in transportation and time-saving devices and all these things. But I think it's important to shine the light also on how processes of migration of individuals also shapes development processes in communities. And I can illustrate this with one quick example of someone I worked with in New York who's from Mexico. He moved to New York 25 years ago, he was explaining to me one day when I was doing field work in 2010, 2011, about his experience when he returned to Mexico in 2006 to visit the community from where he came. It was a rural community outside of Mexico City. And he explained to me, well, through his discussion of his return to Mexico, he touched on how migration has shaped the food practices of individuals in Mexico. So he says, we get accustomed to the rhythm of life and the food of this city. He's referring to New York. So when we go back to the pueblo, we try to bring it back a little. If you're hungry at midnight, if you're hungry at 4 o'clock in the morning, well, that's okay, because for 24 hours you can ask for delivery over there. They have pizza, Chinese food, tacos, they have everything. They have adapted to the system of life here in New York City, and they've begun to implement it a bit there. Mexicans who go back have brought money to the pueblo, and those who don't return are sending money. With this, they have torn down their houses of palm and adobe and constructed bigger and prettier ones, and they have started businesses. Here, in New York, you can't do anything because you don't have documents or a social security number to buy something or to put up a business. So you come here, you learn something, and then you bring it back to Mexico. Restaurants, construction, what else? Factories, niñeras, nannies. All of these jobs that the Americans don't want to do, these are the ones that we do. And the people come here from Mexico to do them. They work in a pizzeria here, and they learn how to do pizzas, and they return there and put up a pizzeria. So Alejandro, I think, is suggesting how migration processes have shaped development of his community. And I thought that excerpt kind of explained a bit about that process at a very micro level.
It was also noted that the traditional foods are changing. So younger generations are preferring foods that are newer to the scene, right? That maybe are store-bought items, as opposed to some of the more traditional foods that the women acknowledge that they still prefer. So there may be this loss of traditional ecological knowledge occurring. More research is definitely needed to kind of figure that out. But I'd like to supplement this example with quite another example. From Costa Rica, where I began working in 2009. And in this particular community is a tourist community. So today there are multiple chain grocery stores. There are a lot of restaurants that serve pizza and fried chicken and French fries and a lot of foods that tourists like. Well, throughout my research, I found that women in this community prefer those foods. They crave those foods during pregnancy, for example, as opposed to foods that came from the farm. Older women discuss just eating healthier, eating foods that came from the farm, not eating packaged and processed foods. So this is a major concern there. Overweight and obesity is a problem. Hypertension is becoming an issue in this community. However, we can also look at the flip side of that, which is that 20 years ago, there was not a whole lot of diversity in the crops being grown in this particular community. So along with this tourist development, along with these grocery stores, along with these restaurants, along with the fact that women can now purchase processed packaged foods, they also have access to produce, more produce from other places. They have access to some of this knowledge. So there's much more diversity in what's being grown in the area for those who are still growing. But things like child malnutrition have gone down drastically. This is no longer an issue in this community. Child anemia is no longer an issue in this community. Infant mortality is no longer an issue in this community. And a lot of that is attributed to nutrition. So really my main point here is I think that these issues are really important in understanding how development shapes local foodways, how it's impacting traditional ecological knowledge. But I think we also need to ask some other questions in having this conversation. Questions like, what is traditional ecological knowledge? How do we define that? What are traditional foods in a particular community? What are the implications of shifting foodways?
the impacts of seasonality on Nauruan dietary rhythms, the community cooperation required for food preservation, the knowledge of how to preserve pandanus fruit, and the social restrictions regarding food distribution and consumption would have become less significant in Nauruan daily food practice than constraints on food access arising from economic status and links to European vendors, copra trade relations, and relative capacity to produce copra for export. So different social factors become important in determining what Nauruans are eating. Yet Nauruans at the same time, as with many other oceanic people, did not simply adopt an entirely new way of living and eating. Instead, they incorporated foreign goods into their own lives and cultures, which were simultaneously changing as a result of colonial, religious, and demographic health influences. And as Salins observed amongst the New Guinean Highlanders, the first commercial impulse of the people is not to become just like us, but to become more like themselves. They turn foreign goods to the service of domestic ideals and to the objectification of their own relations and notions of the good life. Now, in practice, this means that while foods might be imported, the sensory experience derived from them, the value attached to them, and the restrictions associated with the consumption of them are not necessarily simultaneously imported with the products themselves. So while imported foods were adopted as consumable goods, their status as social objects was less clear. For example, eating canned fish was not taboo to people like menstruating women, although eating fresh fish was. A more recent example from my own fieldwork concerns oxo stock cubes, the small foil-wrapped cubes of salt that are intended to make soup or stocks in my part of the world. In Nauru today, these are found in large plastic jars on shop counters, and they're purchased as individual cubes. They're consumed as a snack by licking or sucking them, and this is despite Nauruans' recognition that the same product is used by foreigners to make soup by dissolving it in water. And this process of local adoption of imported goods tends to be overlooked by researchers that attribute health problems like obesity broadly to an imported diet of Western food.
So, as a human and a biocultural anthropologist, I know, and you know, how important food is. Food not only provides us with the nutrients and the energy we need to survive on a daily basis, to live, but it also provides us with really important social and cultural constructs. Sharing a meal with a friend, sharing in the cooking process with others, right? This cements social ties. It's certainly important in our society as well as many others.
I got to thinking a bit about how development processes shape communities and food practices in particular through my doctoral work with Mexican migrants living in New York, in Queens, New York. And I was trying to understand how migration shapes the food that Mexican migrants are eating in New York as a result of changing economic, social, temporal conditions, constraints that result after migration. But in thinking about this, what I noticed while doing this fieldwork was that there was an interdependence between the changes that Mexicans in New York were experiencing and those that they spoke of occurring in their communities back home in Mexico. And to me, this suggested just the importance of looking at how migration of individuals across the US-Mexico border shapes development processes of communities in Mexico.
So rice is a really important component of the Nauruan diet, both every day and, as I'll get to soon, in feasts as well. And it's a really curious element for me because people in Nauru would consistently tell me that the traditional staple food in Nauru is rice. Traditional starchy staple carbohydrate in Nauru is rice. But rice has never been traditionally cultivated in Nauru. It's never been cultivated in Nauru at all. And the earliest imports of rice probably date back to the late 1800s and the colonial authorities and passing trading ships that were bringing foods into the country that would withstand the long ship voyages in order to arrive at Nauru. And I suspect that the importance of rice in the Nauruan diet was amplified not only by the Second World War and 5 years of occupation by Japanese, when there was very little else to eat apart from rice and occasional pumpkins, but also from the past 80 years of mining, where the mining labourers have largely been Chinese workers. And the Chinese, of course, have brought a great deal of their culture, and especially their food culture, into Nauru. And they've come at around the same time that the foods themselves have been imported. So here we start to see kind of not only foods as raw materials being imported, but food practices being imported along with them.
Yeah, it's important to note also, though, that these changes in development or changing food practices don't happen in a unilinear way. It's not that everyone's just eating cheeseburgers and forgetting about corn tortillas. And they also don't happen in a unidirectional way. Just as much as migrants in New York are returning home or remitting things or sending goods home, their relatives are also sending them goods, foods, fresh-made cheeses, fresh-made breads, corn tortillas. All these things are impacting the way in which their Mexican migrants living in New York, the food practices they have. Also, the Mexican migrants setting up puestos and little stores in New York are often using some of the ingredients, recipes sent from their families back home to do them. So there's very much an inter-exchange. It's not like center periphery and everything's sort of gravitating away from the center towards the periphery to influence it. Is very much an interchange. And the third thing is that development processes and nutritional changes don't happen in equal matter. They don't affect everyone in the community at the same time, at the same pace, in the same way. People's experiences are different, often as a reflection of their different economic resources, access to money, income, job, remittances. All those things influence the way in which development, the way in which nutritional change is experienced in these communities.
It's not as easy to just apply a simplistic cause and effect model, right? As I said earlier, food and foodways are dynamic. They're always going to be changing and they're always going to be adapting. And I think the real key here is to remember that there's always little room for negotiation, not to downplay the negative impacts of development on local foodways and local realities at all. Because in many cases, we are seeing the trend in overweight and obesity, the consumption of processed and packaged foods contributing to that, which is a major issue, especially during pregnancy. However, I think that again, we need to go back to this dynamic nature of food and this complexity of it when we're having this discussion.
The other component of the meal, the protein component, is equally interesting. Today, fish that's consumed with a meal might be caught fresh, or it might equally be tinned. And this goes back to again, colonial period of time when tinned foods were regularly imported onto the island. And when things like tinned fish were originally imported onto the island, quite often there are records of Nauruan families catching fresh fish, selling it to the expatriate population, and then using the money to purchase the canned fish. Now, it's not really clear why they did this, whether tinned food was a status symbol or whether they liked the taste better. But one thing that's particularly interesting is that in Nauru, in the past, fresh fish was surrounded by a good number of taboos. So, for example, menstruating women weren't allowed to eat fish for fear of their kind of consumption of the fish scaring the other fish away from the island. And there were a series of other restrictions like that. Now, these same restrictions didn't apply to tinned fish. So tinned fish could be eaten by anyone, any of the time. Having said that, during the wealthy period of time in particular, Nauruan people could either just begin fishing for sport or for pleasure rather than necessarily to purchase food. And they also, in a lot of times, started to use different technologies to catch the fish that they did, which means that there was a considerable amount of de-skilling that occurred. So fewer people knew how to fish, and indeed when the economy collapsed in the early 2000s, there was a great deal of talk about the fact that people had to relearn the skill of fishing. And I remember a very good friend of mine one day saying to me, "Oh, during the economic collapse, I had to go out to the reef and relearn how to fish, and I had a mate teach me how to net fish, and he said, "Do you have any idea how much it hurts your body doing this kind of thing?" I couldn't walk for 2 days afterwards. So there's clearly not only a de-skilling in terms of understanding how to do something, but also having the physique and knowing the bodily practices of how to do these kind of things.
Although I just presented a pretty stark situation with high food insecurity and high chronic disease rates in the townships of South Africa, we are now seeing some ways that people are combating this in a positive development type of aspect. People are showing resilience, right, to these chronic diseases and to pretty much an adverse or a bad food environment. And the way that we're seeing this being combated, or the way that we're seeing resilience being displayed is by seeing people join things like community gardens. Through nonprofits and non-governmental organizations, there's been a big outreach to help these people, or to help local township residents develop their own farms. This has really worked out from what I've seen, and there's two different ways that we're seeing the farming initiatives occur. So we have little small, in your little township plot, in your little home, little container type farms where you can grow your own organic vegetables. Or we also see a community effort where we see people or whole communities collaborate and take a little small plot within the townships and start to grow green food items. This is wonderful because not only does it combat or help decrease chronic disease rates through physical activity and access to vegetables constantly, part of my research will be looking at to see exactly how much of the food is really being consumed by the people farming the foods. That's another part of the research that I'll be doing. But what we are seeing that not only does these small farming initiatives, not only do these farm initiatives help with chronic disease and risk, we also see them contributing to or decreasing rates of food insecurity. If you have your own plot of land and you have a little bit of stability in the amount of food that you get every week or every month, then you're less food insecure. And this is very important.
Community members told me that they knew what they should be eating: more fresh fruits, more fresh vegetables, fresh herbs, but they were unable to access these foods. The produce markets were too far away. They couldn't grow their foods outside of their houses like they used to in Guatemala. That they didn't have a car and vegetables are too heavy to carry long distances. And so they were utilizing local convenience stores to buy ready mixed ingredients, or just picking up fast food because it was close and easy and convenient. So as a result of this research, I found that community members desired to have fresh fruits and fresh vegetables, and was able to gain some grant monies in order to provide small gardens at the homes of Guatemala Maya families desiring to grow fresh produce. Over the course of the implementation of this project, I found that there were other difficulties in terms of growing fresh food. It wasn't that community members lacked the knowledge. They had the knowledge of growing the food, and it wasn't that they lacked the inclination, but a lot of times the economic and circumstances meant that they were renting homes and that their landlords were unwilling to allow them to have gardens on their properties. So even with the project and the grant monies and the support, a lot of times there were other factors in their lives, structural factors that were barriers to the community accessing fresh foods.